be talking about the Sony A1. Now I had this in my hands for about 24 hours, so I was able to kind of put it through its paces a little bit. I was able to try out all kinds of different things. Unfortunately, it was very grey, it was very rainy, as it seems to be every day now, but I was able to try out things like very high-speed shooting, video, photos just in general. I shot everything handheld, so everything you'll see in this video was completely handheld because I wanted to try out things like the image stabilisation, just to see how it felt and all that kind of stuff, and I kind of know how it's going to perform on a tripod anyway, so I like to feel it in my hands, you know, feel it out and about, feel it back in the kind of studio environment that I set up as well, just so we can get a real feel for this camera. Now, of course, I'm guessing if you're watching this video, you probably already know a little bit about the A1. It's a pretty big deal, to be honest. Sony really came out swinging in terms of specs and stuff like that. This is a big deal. So let's just go over the headline stuff. 8K video up to 30 frames a second, which is exciting. We're gonna get more into that in a bit. 50 megapixel stacked CMOS sensor, which I've got to say the images look great, but that's a really good amount of resolution. And of course, 30 frames a second, continuous shooting. That's full 50 megapixels. That is a big deal. That's actually gonna affect a lot of people, you know, obviously sports, wildlife, but also events, all kinds of stuff. That's really gonna allow you to properly capture the specific moment you want to get. It's gonna really help. We're gonna get into autofocus, we're gonna get into all of that. And usually I'd want to start off with image quality because, you know, that makes sense. It's a camera, it makes sense to start off with image quality. But I just want to talk a little bit about what this camera means and kind of who it's for, because this is the first time we've seen a proper flagship camera from Sony. We've talked about flagship stuff in the past. The A7R IV felt kind of like a flagship camera, you know, 61 megapixels, and then good video specs as well. The A7S III certainly feels like a flagship video camera for Sony because it's got all kinds of stuff that we've been waiting ages for, 10-bit video, and then of course 4K 120, all that kind of stuff. But then this camera really does feel properly flagship because it combines all of those great things from those different cameras into one camera, which is what I assume the naming convention is about, the A1. I assume it is because it combines everything into one camera. So you've got the high resolution of the A7R IV. Admittedly, it's not 61 megapixels, but 50 megapixels is not bad at all. That is still very high resolution. You're really never gonna need more than that, and it gives you loads of room to crop, all kinds of stuff like that. 30 frames a second, continuous shooting, that's faster than the A9 Mark II. So that's really impressive because that's already the kind of sports, wildlifey kind of fast camera, and this is way faster than that and at 50 megapixels. 8K video, that's a higher resolution than in the A7S III, and then you've still got things like 4K 120, 422, 10-bit, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot from all those kind of different ranges, the A7R, the A7S, in this camera, the A9, and even the A7 III, which is actually what I'm shooting this part of the video on, which is kind of my kind of favorite hybrid camera. The A1 really just steps up that bar as to what a hybrid camera is. It's very much a photographer's camera in terms of 50 megapixels, 30 frames a second. And then it's very much a videographer's camera in terms of 8K, 4K 120, 10-bit, 422, S-Log, S-Cinetone, all that kind of stuff in the camera. So it is the most impressive, I think, hybrid camera that I have used. So let's just get into some of the other stuff. And I want to approach it from the perspective of someone who actually shoots photos and video for clients and things like that. So using this from a professional standpoint, because that price point, I think it's fair enough for the kind of camera that you're gonna be getting, but it is in that kind of slightly higher bracket. You can check out the full link for the price and all that kind of stuff down in the description. And of course, before we get into it, I would also love to hear what you think about this camera. If you already have any thoughts, you know, what parts of it kind of apply to you? What parts of it appeal to you? 8K video, 30 frames a second. Is there stuff like that that you would use in your kind of photography or video workflow? I'd love to hear about that down in the comments. But let's kick things off by talking about the image quality. Now, predictably, as you can almost definitely imagine, this looks great. Everything just looks really fantastic. There's loads of detail. 50 megapixels is a lot. It means you can crop in, you can still retain loads of detail. The colors look fantastic. It's just a very, very pleasing image, whether you're doing photo or whether you're doing video. Now, of course, you've got the option of the mechanical shutter and of course the electronic shutter. The electronic shutter is going to give you 30 frames a second for continuous shooting. And oh my goodness, that is a good time. 30 frames a second, whether you're into sports, wildlife, or even, like I said at the beginning of this video, events, you know, where you want to capture that moment. 30 frames a second just allows you so much opportunity, should we say, to get that perfect moment. Now, I tested this out with my dog running both towards the camera and running around and trying to get some birds in flight because I wanted to test out the animal eye autofocus, the bird eye autofocus, which we'll come on to, and the tracking as well. And I've got to say, you know, spoilers for the next bit of the video, but as you can imagine, they work unbelievably well because Sony autofocus is ridiculous. It is so good. So 30 frames a second at 50 megapixels, that is very, very fast. And the camera itself is, Sony tell me, 8 times faster in terms of the new Bions X processor than in the A9 Mark II, which is already super quick. So this is very, very fast. And so for things like the 30 frames a second, 50 megapixels, you are going to want to use a CF Express Type A card, of which this has 2 card slots. You can also put SD cards in this camera, but obviously you won't be able to use the super high speed stuff like you will be able to with the CF Express Type A. And I've got to say, to be completely fair, 50 megapixels, 30 frames a second, that is going to eat up some card space relatively quickly. There's nothing you can really do about that. That just is how it works. You know, this is going to chew through a bit of memory. So it's worth being aware of that when you kind of go to do the 30 frames a second, 50 megapixels. You are going to eat up that card space a little bit. But I tested this out with my dog. It worked incredibly well. I was using the animal eye autofocus, and he is a difficult subject for that because he's got black fur, he's very kind of fluffy, so his eyes aren't always super visible, but it tracked him, no worries, as he was running towards me. That was absolutely fine. And then I also tried it with the bird eye autofocus on while I was tracking a bird flying just across kind of my local park. Now, the bird eye autofocus is new to the A1, and I've got to say, it's so easy to use. You just set whether you want to use human, animal, or bird for the eye autofocus, turn on to bird, point it at a bird, and a little green square is going to come around the eye of the bird. Perfect, easy, super, super easy to set up. And then that makes it unbelievably easy to take photographs of birds. Now, there's not super exciting birds in the park near me, and because of lockdown, I couldn't really go out and find somewhere super exciting. So really it's just ducks and seagulls and swans and that kind of stuff. But you know, they're still birds and it still absolutely worked, and it was perfect for tracking them in flight. And that is where, with the 30 frames a second, the blackout free shooting really comes into its own. That is super helpful for taking those photos, and that would be the case with sport, I imagine, all kinds of wildlife events, all that kind of stuff. Because it is blackout free, you are able to see clearly what you're looking at the whole time. So if you're tracking something, like in this case a bird flying, it's very easy to keep track of it because you're never losing sight of it as it blacks out. It's blackout free. That's what blackout free means, I guess, is there's no black. Now, we've been talking about autofocus, so let's just dive into it a little bit. We don't have to spend ages on it, and I'll tell you why. Because if you've ever used Sony before, you already know that it's incredibly good. The eye autofocus is pretty much unbeatable at this point. The human eye autofocus is ridiculous. The bird eye autofocus, which is new, we've just been talking about, is really, really stunningly good, actually. It makes bird photography really impressively easier, should we say. It takes out a little bit of the work with the autofocus, allowing you to focus on composition, tracking, all that kind of stuff. And then of course, animal autofocus as well. It's just a nice thing to have in there if you want to take photos of your dog, your cat, or anything like that. There's also touch autofocus on the screen, and I've got to say, something about the screen, the touch functionality works very, very well. We'll come on to that in a little bit, the screen and that kind of stuff. But the touch functionality works fantastically. And actually there's the ability to touch the screen to actually begin tracking anything on the screen. And I tried that for all kinds of stuff, following Matilda, my subject, following animals, my dog, things like that when I wasn't using autofocus. And it works super, super well. The camera just keeps track of that area that you have touched on there. You can cancel it and go back to autofocus or whatever it is you want to use. It's a very versatile and easy to use system. In fact, while we're talking about the system as well, I should probably mention, this has the new menus that we saw in the A7S III. And if you've not used those before, I actually really like them. So I use Sony all the time. I'm used to the old menus, but these new menus are very intuitive, I think. Everything is exactly where you think it should be, so it makes it very easy to navigate through and change whatever setting that you're looking for. If you've used Sony in the past, it really is only going to take you a couple of minutes to get to grips with this camera pretty much in its entirety. It's very familiar while also feeling new, and I've got to say it feels very, very solid. The buttons feel good, it all feels very sturdy, you know, well made, very much a pro camera, which is nice, especially considering the price point. Now, I mentioned at the start of this video that everything shot in this video that you're going to see, photos, videos, all that kind of stuff, was completely handheld. And that was because I wanted to test out the image stabilization. Now, I use pretty much handheld video and photo almost all of the time, apart from right now when I'm filming myself. And that's because I like the freedom it allows me to move around, to get movement in my video shots, all that kind of stuff. But it's always interesting to me to see how image stabilization works, because of course you could put it on a gimbal and it's gonna look fantastically smooth. But we're kind of not gonna learn anything from doing that, you know, because that's really just testing out how smooth is the gimbal. And I know how smooth my gimbal is, so that's fine. I wanna test out how smooth can I get this camera using image stabilization from the camera. And I've gotta say, I really did test this out pretty extensively. Lots of walking shots, lots of panning shots, and I even tried running with the camera. So I got Matilda to jog just along the seafront, and I tried to kind of run with her, just completely handheld, shooting around about 35mm. So not super wide, but certainly not super tight, because I didn't want to add loads of shake because we were shooting at such a like a long focal length. That would be unfair. But shooting around 35mm, I wanted to see how is this going to perform if I literally run while holding the camera. And actually, I was really surprised by how well that held up. I was not expecting it to do as well as it did. Now, of course, it's not as smooth as a gimbal, obviously, that's totally expected, but it does actually provide you really quite decent image stabilization. I think it feels, at least, like a step up from previous cameras. Now, speaking of video, there's a lot to unpack here as well. Of course, this is a great photography camera, but it's also a really, really nice video camera as well. So obviously the headline spec, 8K up to 30 frames a second. Okay, so this is me just filming myself in 8K to do a little bit of a test for the 8K footage. Now I was gonna film all kinds of stuff in 8K. I was gonna film the whole review in 8K. I was gonna film things out and about in 8K, but to be completely honest with you, there's a few reasons why I didn't. One, it's actually getting pretty late and I've run out of time with this camera, so I really wanna test this out before I completely run out of time. Two, the weather's not been great, as you've probably seen from some of the footage and some of the photos. It ended up getting really misty and really grey and just raining and horrible. So I wanted to film something in 8K to really test it out. Also, I'm not completely made of hard drive space, so I wasn't gonna do hours and hours of 8K footage, but this is interesting. I haven't seen it myself, so I have no idea what it looks like, but I'm shooting super wide. So you might be able to see things like my light, my microphone, of course, my computer, the whole sort of setup. And the reason for that is I want to be able to crop in. I want to crop in once, twice, maybe 3 times. I want to get a feel for how that kind of works, how that looks. So that's pretty much the biggest thing about 8K footage, right? Is that it allows you a huge amount of flexibility in post-production. It allows you the flexibility to crop in, obviously, to add a slow zoom, to add a pan, all kinds of stuff. So I'll be interested to see what this looks like, you know, what it's like to use on the computer, which I'll mention after this segment. So this is being recorded before any of the other talking bits. And then, of course, I want to see, you know, how usable it would be for all kinds of different things. I would imagine you'd use it probably not for like a whole interview, for example, but you might use it for parts of an interview or a product shot or something where you need a lot of detail and maybe some flexibility in post. So I could definitely imagine integrating 8K into some of my workflow. I think for most things, 4K is enough, right? 4K still gives you a huge amount of flexibility. You can still add those zooms, you can still crop and post, all kinds of stuff like that. 4K 120, obviously, on this camera. Ooh, really nice, but hey, I'm never ever going to turn down something like 8K 30 frames a second, 8K 25 frames a second in this case. It's just a useful thing to have, you know? Now, I'm not saying you would shoot in 8K all the time or even really anywhere near all the time. I would almost definitely shoot mostly in 4K, because that is a way more useful and also kind of memory friendly resolution to shoot in. However, it is very nice to have that in there, and there's certainly going to be situations where that may come in handy. But for me, the biggest part of the video, and this is something we saw in the A7S III as well, is the 4K up to 120 frames a second. That's really nice slow motion in 4K, so you can still do things like crop, add a bit of a zoom, all that kind of fun stuff, but it's all in 4K, it's all very nice. I think that's really good, that fits into my workflow so nicely, and I think for videographers, that is actually gonna be the one, especially if you're doing kind of commercial clienty work, that is the frame rate and the resolution that's gonna work really, really well. That's also in 10-bit 422, so there's loads of room there for color grading, there's loads of information there to play around with, which is really, really helpful. Something, again, we saw in the A7S III, and it's really nice to see it here in this camera because it makes it a very capable, professional video system. Now, of course, you've got S-Log in there, and you've got S-Cinetone as well, which is great because it means that if you're trying to match it with an FX6 or an FX9 or something like that, you can do color matching really quite easily there. And if you're going to use it in conjunction with someone else, or perhaps you're a freelancer who's then working with a bigger production studio who is using cameras like that, it's going to be very easy to match up. You're going to be in a good situation there. Of course, if you want even more detail and color grading and all that kind of stuff to play around with, it does have the full-sized HDMI output on the camera, and you can do 16-bit RAW from the camera. So that is always exciting. And again, just adds to the professional kind of capabilities of this camera as both a video system and a photography system. And speaking of the connectivity of this camera, there's an Ethernet port in there, as well as obviously the full-sized HDMI port. So that Ethernet port obviously is going to be fantastic for stadiums and sports photography and all that kind of stuff. You've also got USB-C on there. Of course, as you would almost definitely expect, there's a microphone port and a headphone port as well, just to add in that kind of ability, the versatility of this camera. Now let's talk about the body. What is it like to hold? What is it like to use? Well, like I said before, if you've used Sony before, this is going to be incredibly familiar. You know, it feels very nice in the hands. It feels very solid, very pro build kind of level. The grip is nice and deep. It's very comfortable. The buttons are exactly where you'd expect them to be, especially if you use Sony before, but it's all nice and ergonomic, nice and usable. The screen is going to be a point of contention, I think, because it's not a flip out screen. It's not a fully articulating screen. It is just the normal kind of flip down screen that you get in things like the A7 III, the A7R IV, not like the screen on the A7S III. Now, I think that there's a bit of a split over this, whether you prefer the flip out or whether you prefer the screen like this. So that literally just comes down to personal preference. I think I prefer the flip out screen of the A7S III. I've always thought that, but actually I didn't have any problems with this one. So there was never a point where I thought this is annoying. I wish it was flip out. I probably do wish it was flip out, but I think that's literally just a personal thing, whether you prefer flip out or whether you prefer the flip down ones. It's a shame it's not a higher res screen. It's 1.44 million dots, so that's a little bit of a shame, but it is made up for with the viewfinder, which, is like actual honey. It's that sweet. It's a 9.44 million dot OLED viewfinder, 240 frames a second refresh rate. So I think that's the fastest ever. And I've got to say, this is the closest to an optical viewfinder I've ever experienced. It's a shame there's no way for me to kind of actually show you how nice it is to look through that within this video, but you'll have to trust me that it looks fantastic. If you ever get a chance to try that out, it is so, so good. It's difficult to go back to kind of any other viewfinder, to be honest, because it's such a nice experience using that viewfinder. Now, in terms of battery life, it takes the Z battery, as you would probably expect. I just used one charge for what I was doing, and I was out for most of the day and then also at home as well. I didn't actually have to charge the battery up. I did pretty much exhaust the battery. To be fair, there's a lot going on in this camera. You know, 50 megapixels, 30 frames a second, that's gonna eat up a bit of battery. You know, 8K video, that's gonna eat up a bit of battery. You know, 4K 120, it's gonna eat up a lot of battery is what I'm saying, I guess. So it's understandable that it gets through it, but it wasn't like it got through it super fast. I was still able to do loads of stuff. A full photography shoot, video shoot, and then video back here. There's loads of stuff I was able to do with it before I kind of exhausted that battery. From a personal perspective, this is probably the most exciting camera that I've ever used. I love Sony anyway. I love all these extra things there. The A7S III was probably my favorite camera I've ever used. I would say that this probably beats that out because it's got all the photography stuff that I would want as well. There's nothing that I think this camera would be bad at. It's just very, very good in every direction that you might want to go. So if you're a videographer, this is going to be fantastic. Although admittedly, if you are specifically a videographer, not a photographer at all, I guess the A7S III is going to make way more sense just because of the price point. But if you're in any way a hybrid shooter, or you think that photography is something you want to do with video, or the other way around, if you're a photographer, but you do a little bit of video, this is going to give you so much versatility and so much ability. I love it. I really, really love it. And I'd love to know your thoughts as well. So pop them all down in the comments because I'd love to hear what you think about this camera. Is it for you? Is there anything you love about it? Is there anything you hate about it? I'd love to hear everything you have to say down in the comments, so pop it all down there. Of course, any questions as well, pop it down there. I'm sure there's loads of stuff that we haven't talked about, but I'm also aware I don't want this video to be 40 minutes long. So pop any questions you have down there and I'll do my best to get back to you ASAP. Of course, you can check out the camera for yourself with the specs, the price, all that kind of stuff. There's a link in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. We've got tutorials, we've got reviews, we've got all kinds of stuff all the time. So make sure to subscribe for all of that. I will see you in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.